Hello and welcome on the Barricades. This is your host, Maria Cernat, and on the Barricades is a podcast produced by Eastern European journalists that analyze events from politics, economy from a critical perspective. And with me today, we have Paul Embery, firefighter, trade unionist, pro-Brexit campaigner, and blue labor thinker, columnist for The Unheard. Thank you for being here with us today, Paul.
My pleasure.
So you wrote a very interesting book, and it was published this year. It is called Despised: Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class. And it is a very, I would say, challenging and interesting book from a lot of perspectives. But I want you to tell me, because from my point of view, this is the most important problem, that we have an intellectual left that is very developed in terms of concepts and a working class. And unfortunately, the two are often disconnected. And that is a sad thing and the reason why the left keeps losing, in my point, from my perspective. So I want you to tell me, was this book enthusiastically, received? What was the best reaction that you get and the worst reaction that you get after you published it?
Well, there were some very interesting reactions, actually. I found that a number of people on the left in Britain reviewed the book without even having read it, which was quite a strange thing to witness. And some people even encouraged others on the left not to read it because they'd made their minds up about it before they'd even read it. They decided that it was a far-right manifesto, that it was a book that was arguing for fascist ideas, which was a complete load of nonsense, to be perfectly frank. And, you know, I would like to think that some of those people are quite embarrassed by some of those comments now. But what the book really set out to do was to explain how and why the left in Britain had become so disconnected from its core vote from ordinary working class people. I mean, the Labour Party in Britain was always traditionally the vehicle by which many working class people thought that they would advance their own interests, and there was a real strong connection between the working class and the Labour Party in Britain. But over the last kind of 30 years, that and particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, that connection has just weakened considerably. And I think we're now in a position where the Labour Party has to ask itself seriously whether it is any longer the party of the working class and whether it will ever win power again, because millions of working class people have just stopped voting for it. So I wrote the book to explain why I think that happened. And I wrote it from my own position, having grown up in a working class community, having been an activist in the Labour Party and in the wider Labour movement in Britain for a number of years. And so it stimulated a bit of a debate, but there were lots of criticisms because I think some people are just not willing to learn the lessons on the left, and that's the real problem, I think.
Yes, I particularly enjoyed it, as I told you previously, that chapter where you basically describe what happened into your neighborhood, how things evolved, and why is it that people are labeled racist if they don't like what happened? Because I think it was a reaction to the constant deterioration, to the constant decay of the infrastructure, and it was a reaction to the fact that a lot of poor people came. And when people say to me, well, if you don't accept immigrants, it is because you're racist, I say, I think this is an economic problem. And I want you to elaborate on that and explain for the viewers also what happened to our neighborhood, because it happened in Romania also that we had some people from Sri Lanka, and the villagers in one village in Romania refused to buy bread that was made by those people. But I say, I don't think they have a problem with them because they are from Sri Lanka. Just imagine they would have been extremely rich and they would have come there to run a charity. Do you think they would have the same problems with them? Do you have they are coming to take something economically, and you are put in a situation where you have to compete with them. This is the real problem, isn't it? This is the economic, so to speak. I think that your book is, in a way, it could be called the political economy of racism.
Well, I mean, certainly economic factors are a significant part of it. I mean, what happened where I grew up in the London borough of Barking and Dagenham, which was a very, what we call blue collar, working class community. It was centred around a very big council estate, a public housing estate. And it was a settled and stable community for generations, really. And then the first decade of this century, we had Tony Blair as Prime Minister and a Labour government were in power. And the first decade of this century was very significant in terms of changes that began to happen in working class communities, because this was at a time where the global market was really starting to take effect. So we saw, you know, very rapid and large-scale movements of capital. We saw deindustrialization in working class communities in Britain, where factories closed and industries disappeared and thousands of blue-collar jobs disappeared abroad. At the same time, there was a very kind of liberal immigration policy, which I think is often a symptom of globalization. So we saw very rapid and large-scale demographic change in some of these working class communities. And that was what we call in Britain a perfect storm. And working class communities just felt very, very bewildered and disorientated. And they looked to the Labour government and they said, look, we're not comfortable with what's going on. These people, most of these people were not racist at all. They were decent people, they were quite tolerant people, but they felt that their sense of place and their sense of community and their sense of belonging was being violated by the impact of globalization. And they really wanted the whole process to slow down because it was sweeping them up and making them feel very uncomfortable. And they were really patronized and lectured by politicians who, including Labour politicians, who said to them, well, no, this is good for you. You know, this will improve the nation's prosperity and it will bring you cultural enrichment and that kind of thing. And politicians just stopped listening. And in the end, those communities became very angry and many of their voters just started to abstain in elections, so they didn't vote, or some of them voted for populist parties of the right. And parties like UKIP and the British National Party, which is a far-right party, really. And that process was significant, I think, in weakening the bond between the Labour Party and the working class. And I think, you know, many people in those communities were completely unconvinced by the argument that, well, you know, it's going to make you richer, because they saw what was happening and they didn't feel richer. They didn't feel richer materially. In fact, some of them, I think, felt quite a bit poorer, and they didn't feel richer spiritually either, particularly, or socially or culturally. So that kind of patronizing attitude by many among our cultural and political elites and liberal elites, for whom open borders and the global market is often quite a good thing, because, you know, they do improve their wealth through it, and, you know, they can afford to eat out at nice restaurants and they can afford to employ an au pair and things like that. But for people at the other end of the economic scale, it often had a very different impact. That really is why one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, to explain why communities like mine stopped voting for parties of the left, and you know, that was really what I wanted to achieve.
Well, would you blame Tony Blair, and what was it in the Labour Party? Because the Labour Party was, as you said, associated with, well, labor, workers, and it seems like it moved to some sort of rebranding while Tony Blair was in power. And it was very progressive culturally, like you give rights to minorities, and it was okay. But that was coupled not with progressive measures and regulations in economic terms, but with neoliberal and with things that led to austerity, isn't it? So would you place the blame specifically there?
Well, I think that analysis is broadly accurate. I think the transformation of the Labour Party began slightly before Tony Blair took over as leader in 1994, but he certainly intensified the process. And what happened was this: traditionally, since it was created over 100 years ago, 125 years ago, the Labour Party had always really been a coalition. It had been a coalition between working class, blue collar Britain on the one hand, and more middle class, white collar elements, more liberal elements on the other hand. And the Labour Party was always at its most successful when it was able to hold that coalition together. But what began to happen about 30 years ago is the Labour Party started to become much more middle class in terms of the people inside the party, the people among the leadership. The ideas and priorities became much more middle class, and it became a party that was very much rooted in our fashionable cities and in our university towns. It became a party of graduates. It became a party more recently of social media. And the old kind of working class element of the coalition, the kind of blue collar Britain, small town Britain, provincial Britain, slowly became marginalized. And that working class element is now pretty hollowed out of the party. And that transformation, as I say, took place over the last 30 years, really, but particularly intensified, I think, over the last 15 years. And as a result of that, many people among the working class in Britain look at the Labour Party and think, well, you don't really look like me, you don't sound like me, you don't talk about my priorities, you just talk about the middle class interests that you want to talk about. And you know, the Tony Blair government, as you mentioned, did embrace globalization. I mean, it saw globalization as a very good thing and tried to convince working class communities that it was to their benefit. So it was a very narrow view, and they did embrace neoliberal orthodoxy. They kept much of the Thatcherite kind of economic agenda that we saw in this country in the 1980s. So people, working class people, looked at the Labour Party and just thought, well, you don't really articulate my priorities in an economic sense, and you don't really understand me socially or culturally. Why should I continue voting for you? And that is what lay behind the disconnect, I think.
Yes, I would say so, because on the one hand, you have this very, I would say, toxic, to borrow from the language that is very fashionable in certain leftist circles. So you have this very toxic mixture between, you know, very progressive culturally politics and very, I would say, conservative neoliberal politics that leads to austerity. And you know, you hurt people economically, and then you call them and you label them racist. And I think this is the toxic mixture that sends them away. But what I want to ask, when did you become, I don't know, aware of all these trends? Because you say you are a firefighter. Now, for me, this is impossible. I mean, you are a firefighter, you are a trade unionist, you wrote a book, and now you do all sorts of things. And tell me more, how did you come to these conclusions?
Well, yeah, I'm a firefighter. That's my primary job, and I've been doing that for about 24 years. But I've always been interested in politics. I've been a member of the Labour Party in Britain for nearly 27 years. I've been an activist in the trade union movement in Britain. So I served in the Fire Brigades Union in Britain. I sat on the Executive Council of the Fire Brigades Union. And because I saw what was happening in my community in the first decade of this century, and I saw the very profound changes that were happening as a result of the new global market. And I saw that Labour politicians were getting it completely wrong in terms of how they were reacting to the concerns of working class people and largely ignoring those concerns or dismissing those concerns as being rooted in racism or xenophobia. I could see what was going to happen to the Labour Party in Britain. I could see that there was going to be a huge break, a divorce between working class voters and the Labour Party. I knew it was coming and I predicted it. And people inside the Labour Party and the trade union movement said I was wrong and said, no, you have a nostalgic view of the working class and, you know, the working class are much more progressive than you realise, and they don't have these kind of small c conservative values as we describe them. And of course, you know, the working class is a mix. I wouldn't claim that all working class are small c conservative. You know, they have a diverse range of views, but it strikes me that a significant element of working class voters in Britain, even though they support the Labour Party, still have, you know, small c conservative values when it comes to issues like patriotism and strong families and law and order and immigration and issues like that. And they just weren't being spoken for. They weren't being represented. And worse than that, they were being treated with contempt by the Labour Party. So I saw all of this happening and I predicted it. And many colleagues in the Labour movement argued with me and told me that my predictions were wrong. And I think it's fair to say my predictions have been proved to be accurate. So you know, I think I've earned the right to talk about it, and you know, I wrote the book, and I think the book articulates exactly the views that I feel.
But what about those who considered you to be yourself a conservative, a leftist, a narrow-minded individual that doesn't see, you know, the benefits of globalization and, you know, sees everything reduced to economic problems? What would you say to those people?
I mean, there are certainly people on the left who think that you just have to promise people more money in working class communities and they will vote for you. That it's just about economic factors. And I don't buy that. Certainly economic factors play a part in it. There's no question about that. But actually, if you look at the recent history in Britain, working class people began to stop voting for the Labour Party before the global financial crisis hit in 2008 or whatever it was. The Labour Party had started to lose significant elements of the working class vote before austerity and before the global financial crisis. And it was because people feel that they want their politicians to listen to their concerns, not just about economic factors, but about social and cultural factors as well. And you know, the truth is, if it was just about economic factors, the Labour Party would have won the general election in 2017 when it had a very radical economic manifesto under Jeremy Corbyn. Again in 2019, it had a very radical economic manifesto under Jeremy Corbyn, but it didn't win any of those elections. So what I say to people is, look, of course, you know, working class people want a fairer economy. They don't like a big gap between rich and poor. They don't like regional inequalities. They believe in a higher minimum wage and trade union rights, etc. But also they want politicians to understand their sense of place and their sense of belonging. And they don't like rapid and very large-scale change in their communities. They want politicians to understand their concerns on immigration and law and order and some of those topics that some people on the left think are just right-wing topics that we should never talk about. So I think that is now clear. I mean, Brexit, of course, was a huge factor as well. Many working class communities in 2016 voted to leave the European Union in the referendum. And then what we saw quite disgracefully in the years afterwards were significant elements of the political establishment in this country, including the Labour Party, doing what they could to undermine that vote and to stop it from being implemented. And people saw that the Labour Party were doing that, and they thought, well, this is shocking. We voted in a democratic referendum, and many of us had voted Labour before that, but our party, the Labour Party, is trying to stop that vote from being implemented. So that was also a significant reason why many working class people stopped voting for the Labour Party.
Thanks for watching, and please donate, because you are our only source of support. We rely on your viewers. Go to our Patreon page and stay healthy, keep fighting, and see you all next week.